know how other ministers find their sermon topics, but for me they come from all kinds of strange ways and places. They almost, I hate to admit this, but almost never arise when I'm sitting there and I'm praying and God says, oh, I think you should preach on this. Instead, for me, they're much more likely to come from something I'm reading. Sometimes it's something traditionally spiritual. More often it's a murder mystery or it's a novel. Sometimes they come from current events, things that are going on in the world that I think we need to do some theological reflecting about. Sometimes they come from something as simple as a single phrase that I'll hear or read, and it catches my attention and I start chewing on it. And as it happens, today's sermon came from a group of people who were gathered to discuss, of all things, preaching. While I was on my planning week in January, I was reading a transcript of a podcast by Marcia McPhee. She's the Methodist worship leader who Martha Jones introduced me to, who was the idea for our Advent series, Odd and Odd. And in this particular podcast, it's on the computer, but I have the written version, she's talking with song leaders and other worship leaders and people who write liturgy and preachers and stuff, and they're brainstorming all these ideas, and someone throws out this phrase, spiritual affective disorder. And someone else goes, whoa, cool idea, that'll preach. And what would have been really cool is if they had continued to discuss it so I had some material to work with. But they didn't. They took off in a totally different direction, and that was it. But what I found that week is this phrase kept coming back to me. I'd be sitting there eating my oatmeal, and I would, spiritual affective disorder, or I'd be taking my walk just before sunset, this phrase would come back to me again, and it felt like something that should preach if I could just figure out how to do it, and I couldn't. But I went ahead and put it on my sermon list for the year, because I thought by the time I get here, something will show up, and by George, it has. Not just one Sunday, but 3 Sundays worth of stuff. We'll talk back to it later. As I think back on it, I think one of the reasons that it resonated for me is that, like a lot of, I suspect many of you, I'm in the middle of suffering from the winter blotch. Some of you can relate to that. I suspect it is too cold and it gets dark way too early to engage in any of my favorite outdoor hobbies, like playing with my horses. It is too cold and it gets dark way too early to go out and work on the lawn or work in the garden. It's too cold and it gets dark way too early to do much of anything besides either watch TV or sit there and crochet, neither of which are activities I'm terribly keen on, although I like crocheting, okay? It's a time of year when it's just too dark and cold to get too enthusiastic or excited about very much of anything. And if any of that's true for you, you may have spiritual affective disorder too. Now, I think the other reason it resonated for me, most of you or many of you know that in my former life I was a psychologist, and I can still remember back in the 70s when I was an extremely young undergraduate. And Psychology Today published a study by Herb Kern, and it was really one of those breaking news things. I mean, this was going to change the world of psychology. Herb Kern, who happens to be a researcher, now retired, Herb noticed that during the winter months he was much more likely to be depressed. He was fine the rest of the year, but once it started getting dark and cold, he was clinically depressed. And because he was in the research biz, and he had a lot of friends who were in the research biz, he called some colleagues of his at the National Institutes of Mental Health, and he said, hey, I think we have material for a study here. And they didn't just do one study, they studied it for 10 years, and at the end of 10 years they said, wow, this winter depression thing, which they called winter blues, is real. And not just Herb suffers from it, but a whole lot of people do, especially people who live in climates where it's really dark and really cold in the winter, like in Finland or New Hampshire, where 10% of the population suffers from these winter blues, much less likely people who live in sunny places like Florida in the winter, where about 1% of the people suffer from winter blues. But they figured out this is a real disorder. It has real physiological causes. It has real physiological treatments. And because it was a real disorder, they gave it a real name, which was seasonal affective disorder. And these days, you and I know lots of people, possibly including some of us sitting here, have been diagnosed with SAD, seasonal affective disorder. We know what that's like. We don't tick very well in the winter. Lots of people deal with it, and my guess is that as people of faith, even more people are struggling with that spiritual parallel, which is spiritual affective disorder. Now, spiritual affective disorder doesn't necessarily only occur in the winter. You can have spiritual affective disorder any time of year. But I have learned over the last almost 2 decades in ministry, it's especially likely to show up right now. All the excitement of Advent and the frenzy of preparing for the holidays is over. Christmas, it was so exciting, is over. And we put away the last of the presents. And all of the special friends and family who came to visit us have gone home. And the last of those Christmas cards we were so excited about getting and reading are put away. And it feels like it is going to be forever until Easter and spring come. Part of that is spiritual affective disorder. It doesn't mean we're clinically depressed. That's a totally different thing. It doesn't even mean we're struggling with any really big stuff in our lives right now. Most of us are probably coping pretty well. But it does mean we have a bad case of the spiritual blahs. For example, we may be having trouble praying. Despite the fact that I know every person sitting here this morning has a fine prayer discipline in which you set aside at least an hour a day to pray. Humor me and nod. Yes, we do. Even the most devout of prayers this time of year just can hardly face it. Because you sit down or go walking or whatever position you happen to pray in, and it doesn't feel like God's listening. You don't get any sense of holy presence. It doesn't feel like anything's happening very much. That's part of spiritual affective disorder. Or we may be looking at all the brokenness in the world around us, all the problems in our community and in our lives, in the wider world, all the wars, all the bad news, and we may be wondering, although usually without a lot of enthusiasm, why God doesn't do something about it. Because we know we don't have the energy to do anything about it right now, and we think it might be nice if maybe God would. Or we may be wondering things like, can I come to church right now or participate in church activities? I mean, it's dark in the morning and it's cold and it takes so much effort to get out of our warm, snuggy covers and make breakfast and put clothes on. And, we could sit around in our jammies and worship. That's all spiritual affective disorder. And maybe as kind of a last resort, because we can't pray, we don't really want to go to church or any other stuff, we say, okay, I'm a person of faith, I'm going to turn to the Bible because I have found the Bible to be really helpful in other struggling times in my life. And yet, if we turn to the Bible, we may really struggle with what we read there. Like if we turn to that passage that we heard from Isaiah, the people who lived in a land of great darkness, on them light has shined. And we read that, and we understand the darkness part, and we're not experiencing much of the light part, and we think, well, that was written 3,000 years ago, and those people who lived in Isaiah's time, certainly their lives were not nearly as hard as ours are, and that whole them on whom God has shined light is not us. And then if we read that passage from Matthew, we can add guilt to already feeling bad about the whole thing because we have Jesus. And if you listen to the first part of the passage, you know that Jesus' life is not going very well. well. His cousin John has been arrested. He's in prison. He may be executed. Jesus' own future is not looking exactly positive. But does Jesus give in and get depressed? Heck no! Jesus quotes that passage from Isaiah about the people in the darkness and all the light is gone. And apparently it cheers Jesus up so much, the text tells us he goes out and starts his preaching ministry. And we may read that and go, man, why can't I have faith like that? My guess is if we are struggling with spiritual affective disorder right now, the only passages in the Bible we're very likely to relate to are some of those Psalms, like Psalm 13 that Mark read to us this morning, where the songwriter is saying, how long? Oh Lord, how long is this going to go on? Will you forget me forever? How long must I bear pain in my soul and sorrow in my heart all day long? That's spiritual affective disorder.